Hamaguchi says there are no plans at all to significantly cut down on the number of minigames in the third part of Final Fantasy VII re-trilogy, something that I know for some of you is going to delight and for some others might make a little bit angry. However, what he does say is that they are not going to implement them quite the same as they did in Rebirth, and that they're going to be making some changes. Now, there was a headline reported previously that they were going to cut down on the number of minigames. However, he thinks that in translation, his words got a little misinterpreted, and instead people heard there will be fewer minigames in Part 3. Guys, we got a ton of Final Fantasy VII news updates for you today, so go ahead and hit that subscribe button. So recently, we've had the PC release of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and thus far, it is doing incredibly well. It's a PC port that I personally call the best Final Fantasy experience that you can have right now. While currently we don't have a good idea of sales numbers, one thing that is commonly looked at is the number of concurrent players. And right now, things bode pretty well for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. At the moment, the game has a 24-hour peak of 31,000 players. This may not seem like a staggering amount, no pun intended. However, it's all about the context. Thus far, this is the highest number of concurrents that any PC Final Fantasy game outside of Final Fantasy XIV has ever had. The game that previously held the record for number 1 was Final Fantasy XV, and within its first 24 hours, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has already beat FF15 and FF16. Now, it's hard to know how this directly translates in terms of sales. However, it does bode well that the game is at least selling better than FF16 on PC, and there is some possibility, at least given how strong the game has come out of the gate, that it's selling about as well or maybe even better than Final Fantasy XV on PC, at least initially. In other words, relative to previous FF performance, the game is not flopping on PC, at least as far as we can tell. And for a comparison, God of War Ragnarok had around 35k peak concurrence. It's also worth noting that these games tend to reach their first massive peak concurrent players whenever they hit like the first weekend of release, or at least that's a common trend. That trend happened for Final Fantasy XVI, and if you look at numbers for Final Fantasy VII Remake, those numbers have also been climbing. So a lot of people have been revisiting Part 1 or playing it for the first time, and those numbers are doing pretty well, which implies that a lot of people are taking advantage of the Twin Pack deal. And you can get the best deal on Final Fantasy VII Rebirth for PC thanks to Instant Gaming, as their current price for a Steam code of the game is only $41.65. And you can get the Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth Twin Pack for $58.20. This is normally $70. They also allow us to give away a free game at the end of every month, so be sure to click the link in the description and pinned comment below. Now let's go over to a tweet from Genki here. This is really interesting because he talks about the exclusivity deal and how much they learned from the exclusivity deal from Remake and Rebirth. Here's what they have to say. FF7 Rebirth director Naoki Hamaguchi says he personally thinks it is inevitable that the console and PC versions of Square Enix games will be released at the same time or very close together. Quote, "It is also a reality that the world is no longer in an era where limiting the platform on which a game is played to specific hardware means only the benefits are great. We also realize that through this remake project, and the company has announced that it is shifting towards multi-platform development. Future new IP will be developed along these lines, so personally, I guess that the trend to release console and PC versions at the same time, or both extremely close to each other, is inevitable." Yeah, this is one of those things that anyone really could have figured out, and I'm really surprised that it took Square Enix this long to really put this together. You know, if the game is limited in terms of how many pieces of hardware can play the game, then it's limited to how many people that it can reach. And if you have these really expensive games that have massive worlds like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth with all of these gorgeous cutscenes and all of this like very AAA cutting edge stuff, then you probably need to sell a lot of units. And obviously they do get paid for these exclusivity deals, but clearly it hasn't been enough in order to sustain the game based on the sales that they're doing. So yeah, Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3 has a pretty significant chance of coming to PC day one, and personally, I could not be more thankful for it. Just seeing the huge leap of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth on PlayStation 5 compared to how the game looks on PC and how it plays on PC, if it was my choice and I was able to get these games on both platforms on day one, I would have chose PC, like 100%, no question about it, because the PS5 version did have some issues with it in terms of resolution on the performance mode. It was notoriously blurry, and it's just such a better visual experience on PC that I'd much rather have it for that platform, because it really does feel like that ultimate experience when you're playing it at high resolutions with a high frame rate, and the game is looking good and performing good. Ultimately, that's an experience that I really value, and it's why I recommend Final Fantasy VII Rebirth on PC so much. You know, there's also the Steam Deck too. You know, I want to be able to carry these games on the go, and that is something that Steam Deck allows me to do, and something that PlayStation doesn't quite allow me to do, you know, unless you have like a PlayStation Portable. That's remote play access. It's not native access like on a Steam Deck where you can play it on an airplane or in a car ride. So yeah, I want these games on Steam Deck. Now this is Genki's tweet again about the quote about mini games and that they're not reducing the number of mini games, and I'm happy to hear that personally. Final Fantasy fans begged for more mini games for like the past 2 decades. We're like, where did all the mini games go? And then we finally get a game that actually delivers super hard on the mini games, and now people are like, boo, I hate all the mini games. I find that like infuriating. Final Fantasy should have a ton of mini games. That is something that 7, the original game, kind of baked into the identity. And so to me, the idea of going back on mini games, not having as many mini games, is just nuts. Now, one thing that he did kind of clarify is that they're changing the implementation of the mini games, and I think that that's probably a good idea. I don't think it's a good idea to send the signal that players want less content and there should be less value in the game. I think the better idea is that we want to change how it's presented and how it's paced. A more accurate criticism of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth isn't necessarily that, oh, there's too many mini games or there's too much content, and it's just more like there is too much content in the way that it was presented, such that players felt a need to 100% each area before moving on. I see the need to 100% each area before moving on as a bigger issue than saying, oh, there's too much content or oh, there's too much mini games. Because I think that if you felt there was a large post game for you to do after you beat the game, or there was like, you know, the content was structured in such a way that there was an urgency every time that you got to a new zone to do all this stuff before moving on to the next big story point, then I don't think people would have felt that way. I think they would have actually been really praising the content. So I agree with Hamaguchi's assessment here that like the big thing is to honestly focus on the presentation of the content and the way that they structure it, and I think it'll be received a lot better. And then I know some people are going to be mad just because the number of mini games in order to get the platinum is just so absurd, but then there's a whole discussion there on whether games should be designed around the platinum or if they should just be designed around the average experience, and I know that you guys have a lot of thoughts about that in the comments below. Another translation here provided to us by Genki, who says that Kitase says Part 3 of the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy will not be a next-gen PS6 exclusive like Remake and Rebirth were PS4 and PS5 gen exclusives. For Gamer, for those who played Final Fantasy VII Remake on PS4 and Final Fantasy VII Rebirth on PS5, I imagine there may be some concerns that the third game will be for next-gen consoles. Kitase, no, you can rest assured about the next one, laughs. Hamaguchi then added that in the future, Square Enix will release games on a wide range of platforms so more people can buy them. He says right now he can't promise anything, but will do his best as they want many people to play the games they make. Yet again, this is a reiteration that they hear us loud and clear on the platform exclusivity, and they want these games played by as many people as possible. So they're not going to be doing that anymore. However, PlayStation 5 is 5 years old, and assuming that Remake Part 3 is coming in like, let's say 2 years, PlayStation 5 will be 7 years old. So that would imply to me that there is some possibility that Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3 could be a cross-gen game where it will release on PlayStation 5, PlayStation 6, and PC. Of course, I also imagine that they want this game to run on Switch too. That's really big for Japan. Easily the most crucial, most pivotal thing they can do is make this game run on Switch 2. It will probably take a lot of optimization. They have got Rebirth running on the Steam Deck, so I do imagine things bode pretty well for getting the game to run on Switch 2. And I imagine that a lot of the optimizations that were made for Steam Deck will also see their way into Switch 2. In fact, it was probably a two birds with one stone thing. If we get this game optimized well for a platform like Steam Deck, we'll also be getting it optimized well for a console like Switch 2. Now, bringing Final Fantasy VII to more people is great. However, they also need to broaden the appeal of the game and market it so that people will want to go pick it up. And this is an issue that they recognize. It says here, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth director Naoki Hamaguchi says he can't give a detailed answer right now, but they're aiming to create more chances for players to experience the Final Fantasy VII franchise, as Kitase has also stated. This year, and in those following, they're brainstorming ways to introduce Final Fantasy VII to a new fanbase. You can expect some more developments on that front, so please look forward to it. The only way I can imagine them expanding the Final Fantasy VII fanbase at this point is to have a Netflix series, a live action, an anime, something like that. There's really not going to be any new game that they're able to put out that's going to attract a new audience. If Remake and Rebirth didn't do that by default on their own, then there's not going to be anything else that comes out. There's already Ever Crisis in terms of mobile games, so there's just not like a new thing in terms of video games that's really going to appeal to people in a way that those two games already haven't. So to me, this just basically confirms we have a Netflix Final Fantasy VII thing coming. And as I've said before, I think the best way that they could have done this is to have made Final Fantasy VII Remake into an anime, leading into Rebirth's release, and then leading into Part 3's release, make an anime on Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and have that be Season 2 of the anime. That way people are able to recap themselves on everything that's happened so far, and if they want to, they could skip straight into the third game or the second game, etc. And it would also just serve as a way to get more people into Final Fantasy VII. Now, these animated adaptations and animated spin-offs of other series have been working really well. The Last of Us, Cyberpunk Edge Runners, these shows have been phenomenal shows on their own right, but also have tremendously boosted sales for their games. And so if they appropriately do a Final Fantasy VII anime or some type of Netflix series that really is truly popular, I actually believe that it's something that, even in the late game, can turn around the entire sales situation on these games entirely, make them 10 million plus sellers, and ultimately it just depends on if they can penetrate that mainstream audience, make them really get into Final Fantasy VII, make them go and pick up the games, pick up re-trilogy. So it has to be something good, but the only way I see them doing this is with something Netflix. Now let's go deeper into Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3. Naoki Hamaguchi says the development of Part 3 of the Final Fantasy VII Remake project is going well and is on schedule. Quote, "It is going very well. After Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was finished, we immediately started working on the third game, and by the end of 2024, we had completed a build that was able to confirm what we should aim for as a game. We can already see the direction where we want to land. So we've been working towards that since the beginning of this year. We are proceeding without delay from the schedule we planned when starting the remake project, so we hope you'll look forward to it." Very good to hear that Part 3 is moving along smoothly. There hasn't been any delays. Rebirth came out in a, very short amount of time, relatively. The game spent only about 3 years in development, and considering the number of assets that they have to reuse from both games, I imagine that Part 3 is going to be an even shorter development period, because they already have so much done. They're essentially reusing a ton of the world map from Rebirth already. It makes me think that Part 3's development is going to be fairly short compared to what even, Part 2's development was. But let's talk about something really consequential and really interesting. The ending of Final Fantasy VII re-trilogy. Because as you guys may or may not know, there's been a lot of new things happening in re-trilogy in terms of plot twist and maybe hints that things project will not end in the same way that they did before. Genki's translation of a Famitsu article says, quote, Kitase says the scenario for part 3 of the Final Fantasy VII Remake project was completed by Nomura at the end of last year. He is very satisfied with it, quote, as the next part is the conclusion. I gave Nomura the homework that I want something that would respect the original, while also giving a sense of satisfaction beyond what could be experienced in the original, something that would conclude the remake project that was handed in at the end of the year, and the scenario for the third installment was then completed. I am very satisfied with it, so I'm sure it will be a satisfying conclusion for the fans as well. So actually this is pretty funny, because a lot of the times people are like, Nomura has nothing to do with the story of this project, and I've even mentioned before on this channel, I'm like, no, he's the core visionary of the project. What are you guys talking about? He's very much influential on the story. But a lot of people just kind of assume that because he's not credited, that it's literally only Nojima writing the story. No, as it's mentioned here, Nomura is very influential on the story of the Final Fantasy VII re-trilogy, you know, even to the point of, you know, as he says here, deciding what the ending of the whole project is going to be. So again, there's always like this silly little fan debate on whether he's involved, whether he's not involved. I know some people have contentions with his work, some people absolutely love his work. Regardless of how you feel, he's very deeply involved in the re-trilogy, and it says here that essentially he's come up with the conclusion for how this is going to end, and just the fact that he had to go and do this homework really does imply that there is not going to be the same ending that there was to the original Final Fantasy VII. You don't have to do, and I quote, homework in order to figure that out, right? Like if it's already using the established ending from the original, then you don't have to go and figure that out. And as he says here, their aim is to give a sense of satisfaction beyond what could be experienced in the original. And so, this isn't going to be the original ending of Final Fantasy VII. This is going to be something that tries to go way beyond that. Now, I know for a lot of people that's probably exciting news. For me, that's actually not very exciting news. That's kind of sad news. Because I think that the ending of the original Final Fantasy VII is already one of the most brilliant endings to a story, period. I think it's great. I think the OG ending of FF7 is like a masterpiece. I know a lot of people who say that it was not good, that it was bad, because they don't like specifically clarify like what happens to each character. There's no epilogue. They don't tell you, you know, about like Cloud living happily ever after or anything like that. That ambiguity is part of what makes it good. You can imagine what the characters did. A lot of people also misinterpret the ending and think that humanity died at the end. But that's also not true, because one, we know that's not true from Advent Children, and two, because at the end, Nanaki and Cloud are on the same airship, standing like 2 feet from each other, and if Nanaki survived the impact of the meteor, then like it's worth assuming that the guy who was standing next to him also survived, and if Cloud survived, it's worth assuming that most of humanity survived. So again, there's just no real ambiguity to me on whether or not humanity survived, and they've even confirmed this later in dev quotes that humanity is still alive at the end. Of course they are. That's what Advent Children literally is. That's what Dirge of Cerberus also is. So to me, the ending of the original game was already happy enough of an ending, and we didn't need to be any happier than that, personally. But we'll see. I don't want to get ahead of myself. I want to see what they have in store before I make any judgment about what this could be. Because indeed, maybe it will go above and beyond my expectations, and I always love to keep an open mind about these things. Hopefully it will do exactly that. Now there is one last thing I want to cover, because I feel like so many people grifted this quote from Hamaguchi and made it into something that it just totally was not. Automaton Media did an interview with Hamaguchi, and he says, I respect mods. They breathe life into the PC market. Originally there were articles ran about how Hamaguchi wanted people to be respectful with the mods that were done with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and a lot of people grifted this and turned this into that he doesn't want, let's just say, a certain variety of mods being done with the game, and they tried to make it about things that it certainly was not. You guys know what I mean. Don't make me say the words. This is what Hamaguchi really meant when he was saying that. As someone who plays games on PC, I use mods myself. I'm aware that mods have come to be accepted by the community, and that they bring enjoyment to many players. I see it as a positive thing myself. Hamaguchi was careful to clarify a point from his interview with Epic Game Store. I wasn't trying to tell people not to use mods. It was more about being mindful. Both creators and users alike should ensure that mods don't detract from the intended game experience. He acknowledged the variety of mods available, from UI customizations to more controversial modifications, including extreme concept changes or reverse engineering. There are mods that could shock some players, so I encourage users to research what they're installing for creators to be mindful of their audience. However, Hamaguchi's stance isn't limited to simply approving or rejecting mods. He considers them to have a transformative impact on PC gaming as a whole. I respect the modding community, he says. Mods have played a significant role in the rise of the PC market. Look at series like Fallout or The Elder Scrolls. Even years after release, new mods breathe life into these games, making players want to come back to them. So yeah, all of the talk about Hamaguchi being, against certain mods and, being against modding in general has just been grifted out of control, a narrative that has just been hijacked by, the type of people that you imagine would hijack this type of discussion. Ultimately, it's all nonsense. Hamaguchi says use mods. This is actually very cool because a lot of Japanese devs can be very anti-mod, but Hamaguchi, again, is not one of those devs. So this is a lot of exciting news about Final Fantasy VII re-trilogy. I'm super excited for what the future may hold. So this is a lot of great news about the future of Final Fantasy VII re-trilogy. We have so much to look forward to. In the meantime, we're all waiting for that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth hard mode save file to launch so that we can jump directly in the hard mode without waiting. You guys got to let me know the moment that save file goes live on Nexus. I have just been waiting for it. Until then, be sure to subscribe. Be sure to check out Final Fantasy VII Rebirth on Instant Gaming to get a great deal thanks to our sponsor. And I will see you all in the next video. Later, guys.